So for any of you movie buffs out there, you might be aware that this weekend happens to be a particularly unusual one in cinema due to the simultaneous release of both Oppenheimer on one hand and Barbie on another. Okay. When we think about it, we can't imagine two further diametrically opposed films. One chronicling the life of the physicist who would ultimately usher in the atomic age, and the other putting the plastic fantastic universe of the world's most famous doll on full display in all of its vibrant, effervescent pink glory. It's a phenomenon being coined Barbenheimer, representing the movie lovers' way of dealing with the cognitive dissonance at the idea of the collision of these two cosmos under the same roofs on the same screens. In the spirit of strangeness, please bear with me as I state that this occurrence could not have come at a more coincidental time or place in our Jewish calendar. Again, bear with me. You see, this coming week, starting Wednesday evening, as we just mentioned, is Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, and a day on which we commemorate the destruction of both temples in Jerusalem, fasting and immersing ourselves in the book of Eicha, or Lamentations, as a result. Equally, we're taught in the Talmud that this is the happiest day of the year, apart from, and this you may not have guessed, Yom Kippur. So how do we make sense of this juxtaposition and, in turn, make sense of what this commemoration might mean to us and our communities in a day, an age, and, importantly, a denomination of Judaism that does not aspire anymore to the rebuilding of the temple on Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount? Let's frame this moment in our Jewish cycle. According to the Mishnah on Tisha B'Av, we remember not just the destruction of the temples, but a whole series of catastrophes that our rabbis pin to this date, both before and after the year 70 CE. The rabbis allege that Tisha B'Av was the date that the scouts brought back that demoralizing report from the land of Israel, and the date that Beitar fell during the unsuccessful revolution against the Romans over a century following that. Later, Tisha B'Av became associated with the expulsion from England, the Spanish Inquisition, and in more modern history, the fall of the Western Front in World War I, and the day that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo just prior to World War II. Although this wasn't a specifically Jewish event, of course, it's sometimes seen as an event which set the stage for the horrors of the Shoah. In other words, the desire to attribute our various calamities as a people around this date gave rise to the spiritual significance and spiritual sense that this destruction and its corresponding despondence would perpetually carry us back to this same point on our path again and again and again and again. Yet Tisha B'Av comes exactly 7 weeks before Rosh Hashanah. Unbelievably, we are reaching that time again. And so, if we're able to take a bit of guidance from the classic book about the High Holy Days, This Is Real and You Are Completely Unprepared by Rabbi Alan Liu, he would suggest that we have two choices. That we can regard this as simply a cursed time, or we can take it as the beginning of our process of teshuvah, of returning, in which we turn away from the detrimental pessimism of denial and destruction a la Oppenheimer, and turn instead towards the positivity of healing and learning from our mistakes so that it becomes the reality which shapes our lives and circumstances a la Barbie. Rabbi Liu, in fact, uses the example of our Torah portion from this Shabbat, Devarim, the first in the book of Deuteronomy, With Deuteronomy meaning the great or the second repetition, Moses commences by retelling the tale of the aforementioned spies. He introduces it about halfway through the parashah, despite having also learned about them back in the book of Numbers. And yet, we can pay attention to the subtleties in how the story changes in its second iteration. In the first account, the Israelites are certainly not without blame, to be sure. They're gullible and easily panicked. However, the onus appears to lie with the scouts, the princes of the tribes, who are cowardly and project their own anxieties onto what they saw. And following their descriptions of a place far worse and far more terrifying than they'd actually experienced, they lead the people into fear and then to disobedience. In Moses' second account, though, he shifts the blame from the exaggerated story of the spies to the murmurings of the people who were reported back to. The Israelites are no longer innocent, there's no doubt about that, and the burden of guilt becomes placed on them instead of their princes. As the people find themselves on the brink of the promised land, it is tempting for them to fall into their old ways on the border of their new home and at this significant turning point. Rabbi Lu points out that the natural place for Tisha B'Av is the height of the summer that we are in right now. Directly afterwards, in just a few days, on the 15th of Av, it is when the summer reaches its peak and begins to wane. The sap in the trees has reached its full strength and begins to decline, and the days have reached their full length and begin to shorten. Fullness and decline are inherently interlinked, with one being the end of the other and vice versa. This is because decline and destruction, Lu teaches, necessitates renewal, and retearing must take place before rebuilding. They're all part of the same process, after all, the continuum of the never-ending circle and cycle of spiritual construction and reconstruction. To quote Rabbi Lu, the soul is always teetering between two great tidal pools, the sun and the moon, the conscious and the unconscious, the mind and the heart. Earlier last week, I had the privilege of attending a virtual study session with the Shalom Hartman Institute entitled Feminism and Jewish Theology, a Case Study in Deconstruction and Creativity, which highlighted the notion of this push-pull between brokenness and the hope for redemption. One of the texts that we studied was Shir HaShirim Rabbah, which is often contrasted with the Book of Lamentations. Shir HaShirim Rabbah is the collection of midrashim surrounding the Song of Songs, which tells a parable of the predicament that the people of Israel found themselves in as they stood on the shores of the sea. The rabbis liken this dilemma to a great and powerful king who was desirous of hearing the voice of his daughter, the princess, but could not hear her speak. So he hints to his servants, and they, quote, fall upon her, they surround her like brigands. She cries out to her father, "Father, save me," which he does, and the king then says to his daughter, "If you had not done this, you would never have called out for me to save you." This is comparable, in the eyes of the rabbis, to the people of Israel who were saved by God's mighty hand and outstretched arm once God hearkens to their vocal pleas. Our teacher/facilitator, Rabbi Shoshana Cohen, acknowledged the discomfort of this parable and addressed two different ways that we could approach it. One is, of course, to dismiss it as misogynistic, as sexist, as an example of controlling and even of victim blaming. It's this idea of you turned away, so I had to make you come back to me, or you didn't do what I wanted, so I had to make you do it, and here are the consequences. Applying it to our Jewish calendar at Tisha B'Av, we might phrase this as, the temple was destroyed because you, the people, turned away from me, God. The second approach, though, is to find ourselves in the text and, as committed Jews, search for the redemptive qualities and those angles which will allow us to build and rebuild spiritually again and again. Rabbi Cohen proposed that this could be found through the text illuminating a God who needs us, the people of Israel, so badly that God will come running after us and do anything it takes to be close to us and draw us near. Furthermore, God is portrayed as vulnerable in Shir HaShirim Rabbah, Cohen continued, both capable of injury and of being injured in turn. This places an important measure of power back into the hands of humans and allows for the text to be used as a mirror. God's very existence becomes dependent on people, and in God becoming more human, we might just be able to better reflect God's qualities back into our world, in our own lives. And what better time of year to ponder this call than on Tisha B'Av, as we work on constructing and reconstructing our spiritual characters stronger and richer than before. And both things can be true at the same time, by the way. Tisha B'Av, in the eyes of our teachers, Rabbis Liu and Cohen, could subsequently signal the start of the slow and steady climb towards the High Holy Days then, and with it, the promise of redemption, of renewal, and of hope, if only we're brave enough to see it, and if only we're brave enough to lean into it. Additionally, as we conclude, I want to make one final suggestion, that Tisha B'Av, with all of this in mind, is ultimately about a journey to a spiritual home, or back to a spiritual home. Parashat Devarim opens with an outline of the route that the Israelites have taken on their wilderness wanderings, from Suf to Paran to Tophel to Lavan to Chatzarot, and now they're found in Kadesh Barnea. The people have been through great challenges, from battles to thirst to hunger to crises of faith. And now God says to them, Rav lachem shevet bahar hazeh. You've stayed long enough on this mountain. In other words, we might mourn that initial home and be tempted by and grieve over old ways and patterns of being. Equally, it's about the home that we long for in response, and the journey to an improved home that we take full responsibility and ownership over. This Shabbat then, and in anticipation of Tisha B'Av, let us pray these famous words of Eicha, Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva, return us to you, O God, and we shall return. Let us bridge the cognitive gap between decline and ascent, between repetition and renewal, and let us find our way back home in the process. We hope you will join us in this meaningful spiritual endeavor, either 6 p.m. Wednesday night or 7:30 a.m. Thursday morning for our Tisha B'Av. They're both on Thursday. Okay, join us on Thursday in this meaningful spiritual endeavor for our Tisha B'Av services and study. We wish you Shabbat Shalom.